Without further ado, I am going to introduce our speaker for today. Her name is Dr. April Kaur Randhawa. She is a senior staff scientist at Fred Hutch and the Associate Director of Lab Science for the HIV Vaccine Trials Network and COVID-19 Prevention Network Statistical Centers. Her research focuses on vaccine evaluation and the immune response to globally important infectious diseases such as HIV, TB, and more recently COVID-19. In addition, to the vaccine research, her interests include science communication, cooking, gardening, traveling, activism, and advocacy, and spending time with her family. You can find her on Twitter at April Kaur PhD, and I'll put that in the comment section for you all. So I want to have our speaker now take hold.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. You set me up well with your video as well. So I'm going to share my screen so I can show you some slides. And as was mentioned, my background is an infectious disease biologist. And although I'm a biologist by training, I've always had a passion for science communication and health education and advocacy. So I make it a priority to stay engaged with communities, especially minoritized groups and those who've been historically excluded from research. And often those are the communities most impacted by infectious disease. So I strive to make science accessible for all. So I'm really honored to be invited to speak with you all today. And I'm going to go over some background about COVID-19 and vaccines. Some of this will be not new to everyone, but since we have the time, I wanted to make this comprehensive in case some people don't have the information or if they have questions they want to ask at the end. And then I'll talk about the process that we went through for developing the vaccines and assessing their safety and efficacy, the current recommendations with a hot off the press update from this morning, and what to expect when you're getting vaccinated for those of you who are still considering vaccination. I want to talk about some of the common myths and misinformation that's out there, and then we'll have some time for discussion and questions. And a quick disclaimer that this COVID-19 research and knowledge is changing almost daily. So the information presented here is current as of today, and I have no conflicts to declare. So SARS-CoV-2 is the name of the new coronavirus that was discovered in late 2019. It's the virus that causes the disease called COVID-19, short for coronavirus disease of 2019. And coronaviruses in general are a large family of viruses that can cause illness in animals or humans. In humans, there's several known coronaviruses that cause respiratory infections ranging from the common cold to more severe diseases such as SARS or MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, and of course COVID-19. The primary transmission is from person to person through respiratory droplets that are released when someone talks, sneezes, or coughs. And to prevent the exposure to this virus, we've all been taking many precautions, and I know we're tired of a lot of them, but we've been staying home. If we do go out, we've been trying to keep a physical distance from others, and we've been wearing masks. And while all of these things do help control the spread of this virus, the only way to significantly reduce the threat overall is for enough of the population to become immune to the virus so that they don't pass it on. And some people who have had COVID-19 will develop some level of immunity. However, that immunity might be short-lived, and many people would get really ill if they were exposed to the virus. So they don't necessarily want to just be exposed and develop immunity that way. That could be very risky for a lot of people. So we need a way for people to develop a strong immune response that can prevent infection or severe illness. So vaccination is the safest way to help build up your immunity. And as this graphic shows you here, the vaccine teaches your body to recognize a virus without actually exposing you to that virus itself. That will then cause the cells and proteins that are all part of your immune system to become activated and learn how to recognize that particular virus, so that if you are exposed, they'll remember how to fight that virus and hopefully protect you from either getting infection or getting severely ill. And we've been using vaccines for decades to prevent serious illnesses and complications of vaccine preventable diseases such as measles, mumps, polio, flu. And these can all have serious consequences, which, for some of these can include, like polio, like you could include amputation, hospitalization for other reasons, like pneumonia. Some of these viruses can cause long-term impacts like hearing loss, brain damage, and even death. So these vaccine preventable diseases are still a threat. They still do continue to infect people, but thanks to vaccination, and these are some of the ones that you get as a child, and almost everybody in the world gets these. Thanks to that, there's been a dramatic decline in the number of serious illnesses and deaths due to these diseases. So vaccines, again, stimulate your own body's protective immune response, so that if you're infected with that pathogen, your immune system is ready to prevent it from spreading within the body and causing severe illnesses. So this is probably my most technical slide, so I'll go through it slowly, but I did want to talk through the types of COVID vaccines that are in development and the different technologies that have been used. So all vaccines work by exposing the body to parts of a target bacteria or virus to trigger that immune response. But how they do that is what changes. So the first panel shows the approach taken by two companies called Novavax and Sanofi, which are developing vaccines. They're not as far along and obviously haven't been authorized for use yet. They're just completing their clinical trials now, so we might hear about them in the next couple of months. So they're using a strategy called a protein-based vaccine. So these vaccines contain proteins that are part of the virus, but no genetic material. And this type of approach is what's used for like the hepatitis B vaccine. And then in the middle, we have, I think, what everyone's most familiar with are the mRNA vaccines that were developed by Pfizer and Moderna. And these genetic vaccines use genetic material that's engineered to look like the genetic material from the virus, and delivering those genes into our cells to produce an immune response. And then the third, which is what has been used by AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson or Janssen, we call these vector-based vaccines, and they differ from most conventional vaccines in that they don't actually contain proteins like the first panel, but rather they use your own body's cells to produce them. So they do this by using a modified virus that's harmless, like a virus that might cause the cold, but it's been engineered to be harmless, and it uses that to carry these proteins into our bodies. So that then triggers the immune response and mimics what happens during natural infection with certain viruses, especially certain pathogens, especially viruses. And although these mRNA vaccines are relatively new to being used at a large scale, they have been used before, and all of these technologies have been studied and used for decades. And it's important to note that none of these strategies use actual virus, so they can't cause infection. So just another way to look at this, again, is this is a figure that we often use in some of our HIV vaccine trainings. But by teaching our immune systems to recognize and fight invaders is how vaccines operate. So some piece of the virus or a piece of what looks like the virus is engineered to look like is what is used to train the immune response. So then when your body sees the actual virus, it can kind of sound the alarm. There are certain cells that are always monitoring, kind of surveillance type cells that are monitoring for infections and pathogens and things, and they'll then raise the alarm and call in all those immune cells and proteins like antibodies to then try to control the infection. So one of the most common questions I hear, and also a reason why some people are skeptical about getting vaccinated, is because they said, how did this happen so quickly? Like, you always talk about it taking years and years to develop a vaccine, but then you were able to do this in less than a year. And so this shows like the typical vaccine development process. And yes, it does take a long time, on average about 10 years, where you have studies that are done in like cells or small animals like mice to understand how that vaccine candidate is working. And you have to do a lot of different safety evaluations and different dosing schedules before you're ever allowed to test that vaccine in humans. And then once you get to human testing, there's 3 different stages of clinical trials that are going to start small with a low dose with a small number of people. And if that's shown to be really safe, then you can move on to a larger trial and start looking at additional doses. And then finally, it's that phase 3 trial, which we also refer to as the efficacy trials, where they're really big studies because we really want to understand how these vaccine candidates work in a wide variety of people. And those all take a really long time, each one of those, just to develop the study, to get all the approvals. This is like the main thing I do, day to day is with HIV, doing clinical trials to evaluate vaccine candidates, and each stage just takes so long, and so long that like I've been working on HIV vaccines for 10 years now, and I've yet to see the full stage for any of our vaccine candidates. I've seen some that were already in phase 2 go on to phase 3, or some that were in phase 1 go on to phase 2, but this definitely does take a long time. And then you have a lot of steps to get approval and licensure. Then you have to start scaling up all the manufacturing and the distribution. So it takes a very long time. So the other, consideration with this typical process is at each stage you have to prove the importance to get funding to do the work. So, then we had a global pandemic and everyone was like, let's do this as fast as possible. And we got a lot of, money from the government. A lot of these vaccine companies were piling in a bunch of money as well. And we were able to shrink this process for several reasons. We didn't skip any steps or cut any corners. All the regulatory steps that are required were all done. But what we did do was overlap some of the steps instead of doing them sequentially. And this was made possible because of some of these public-private partnerships between the government and some of the vaccine manufacturers and developers. And thanks to that government funding, those vaccine companies were able to start manufacturing even while these clinical trials were underway. And if some of the trials didn't work out and that vaccine didn't prove to be safe and effective, then they would just destroy those doses. Another factor that led to this being a compressed scale was the technologies that were used. So this mRNA technology, these vaccines are much faster to produce than a lot of other types of vaccines. And the other sponsors like Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca use platforms that have been proven in the past. So they had a lot of these things kind of ready to go for other diseases, and they just optimized it for SARS-CoV-2. So in addition to like overlapping some of these clinical trial stages, we had basically all hands on deck. So when we had to do data analysis or safety reviews, that was all happening immediately instead of having to wait. Normally we'd have to take time to finish what we were doing to then take on the next study and analyze all those data. But this was like our main focus. Everything else was put on hold. We also included more participants than we typically would do. So whereas some of the phase 3 trials we do for HIV vaccines have about 3,000 people. We had 30,000 people in each of these trials, so we can get as much data as possible. And also the disease transmission rates were so high at that time, it kind of enabled us to get an answer quicker than we would for diseases that aren't as prevalent. So, and then the regulatory agencies like the FDA and CDC, they prioritized all of the review and authorization steps just to make sure that was, basically everyone wants life to go back to normal, right? So this has been a priority. So all of these reasons contribute to that compressed time frame. But I just want to make it clear that no steps were skipped, and all of the safety checks, I'll talk more about those in a moment, were all done. So it was just more about a concerted effort. Last piece I forgot to mention was the use of existing infrastructure. And this next slide helps explain that a bit more. So some of you may not be aware that several groups from here in Seattle played a significant role in these vaccine clinical trials. So the group I work with, HVTN, HIV Vaccine Trials Network, is based at Fred Hutch in Seattle. And we are the world's largest publicly funded international collaboration facilitating vaccine development. And we conduct all phases of clinical trials. So we have a lot of expertise in developing these studies, implementing them. We have established clinical research sites all around the world. We have groups that are experts in community engagement and recruitment. We have laboratories that are experts in studying viruses, and we have statisticians and data scientists who are experts in analyzing vaccine study data. So because of this, we were asked very early on, pretty much as soon as we learned about this virus, to use all of the existing infrastructure that we have to pivot our research to address this new global pandemic. So we were involved in developing the study protocols. Because the companies obviously aren't really going to talk to each other, we took one of our first priorities was ensuring that the different trials done by the different companies were harmonized so that later we could compare the results. Obviously, companies aren't going to really do that with each other, but because of the government funding that went into it, they had to work with us, and we gave them feedback on ways to improve their studies. And one of the most important things that we did was making sure that these trials were equitable, not just in making sure we had different ages represented, because we know that people of older age have higher risk of COVID, but we wanted to make sure that the studies also included study participants that had a lot of common health problems that were known to be associated with more severe COVID-19, like high blood pressure, diabetes, cancer. And so I think because of our efforts, those trials were more inclusive, and we do have data on how the vaccines performed in people with different health conditions. But more importantly, we learned early on that there was some data to suggest that the diversity wasn't broad enough, and that there wasn't enough inclusion of different minoritized groups. So we have some amazing scientists that we work with, epidemiologist Dr. Stefan Wallace, and socio-behavioral scientist Dr. Michelle Andrasik, who lead our community engagement and external relations groups. And they worked really hard to correct this. They put together expert panels that represented these diverse groups. So, Black doctors, Latinx doctors, and epidemiologists, and they held dozens of community seminars and discussions to listen to people's concerns and also inform them about, how they could be involved in some of these trials to make sure that these groups who have been historically excluded from a lot of this research have to play a part in it and have to be part of it, so that we know that our communities are getting all the benefits from these vaccines as well. So we all know that this has been a problem in research for a long time, and we've been working really hard to improve that. But I think the impacts we made to these COVID vaccine studies are some of the most important impacts that we made during this process. So then, these headlines are from almost exactly a year ago. This one is November 18th, and this is November 16th. So it was an incredible achievement to have effective vaccines so quickly. Working so hard for all of last year, I, like many scientists, were very hopeful, but we're also completely shocked and overwhelmed by how efficacious these vaccines were. We were hoping for 70% efficacy, and to see like 94, 95% was incredible. And as a contrast, before we switched gears to working on COVID, and we were working on HIV. Although I've been only working on that for 10 years, there's been others who've been working on it for almost 40 years, and we still don't have an HIV vaccine. So this was a real contrast to that, and I think just shows that all that concerted effort and all the funding that went into it really paid off. So now let's talk a bit more about the safety and efficacy of these vaccines. So studies show that COVID-19 vaccines are effective, especially in keeping adults and children from getting severely ill if they do get COVID. I think that for Pfizer, it was like 90% efficacy in the clinical trial, 94% for Moderna. So what was determined in the clinical trials reflects how the vaccine performed in kind of that controlled environment of a clinical study. It's not until we start using these vaccines in the general public that we can collect data on the effectiveness under real world conditions. So far, the effectiveness research, because we're still collecting data now that everyone's, a lot of people are getting vaccinated, the effectiveness in real world conditions is exceptional as well, and shows that these vaccines offer similar protection to what we saw in the clinical trials, with reduced risk of getting COVID and reduced risk of severe illness by 90% or more among people who are fully vaccinated. In addition to providing protection against getting infection or severe disease, there's also evidence now that these vaccines protect against infection without symptoms or asymptomatic infection, and just the overall transmission of this virus to help protect all the people around us in our communities. And while they're working really well, no vaccine is 100% effective, and some people who are fully vaccinated are still getting sick. And we refer to these as vaccine breakthrough cases. And data are suggesting that even these breakthrough cases, that the symptoms are less severe, and there's less hospitalization and death in people who are vaccinated who still get COVID. The people who have compromised immune systems are especially vulnerable, and they might not build the same level of immunity. And that's something we've learned from more effectiveness study in the real world, because we didn't have a lot of those people included in our clinical trials. So we've now learned that people with certain immunocompromised conditions, or who are taking immunosuppressive drugs, need to get a third dose as part of their primary series. Okay, so how do we know that these vaccines are safe? And we have assessed the safety during the clinical trials and are continuously monitoring this with a lot of comprehensive and intense programs. And this occurs at 3 stages. So I'll walk through each one of these. So first, in the clinical trials, as I mentioned, there's 3 phases of these trials. And these vaccines have to go through each stage, and the safety has to be evaluated at each stage before they can go on. And there are guidelines set for each of those phases of clinical trials. And we collect a lot of data about all the different things that people experience. So So in addition to evaluating the results from all those trials, we had a lot of different independent review steps. And these, the studies obviously are put on by the companies, but so we always have to make sure that there's independent review that doesn't include those companies. So every clinical trial includes a data safety monitoring board, which are experts in the field who regularly look at the data and don't wait till the end of the study to make sure that everything is going well and people aren't getting a lot of bad side effects. And if they see that, studies are stopped. We've had that happen in some of our phase 1 studies where, after right away, like maybe there were too many people getting bad rashes, and it's just, it shouldn't be that many people. These data safety monitoring boards will make you stop those studies. So that's a really good checkpoint to have. As I mentioned, our group in the COVID-19 Prevention Network also compiled a lot of expert panels, and the CDC and FDA did the same. And we really advocated for including researchers and clinicians from minoritized groups in those expert panels as well. And then, of course, there's the FDA reviews and the CDC advisory committees reviews as well. And, so as I mentioned, we collect a lot of data during the study about how participants are feeling in general. Even if we don't think it has anything to do with the vaccine, we really have to check out each report of side effects. You've all probably seen the commercials of certain medications, and then they list at the end like 50 different side effects, and that's from those clinical trials. Everything that people reported, we have to include as potential risks. And so it's important that people understand all the different levels during the studies that are focused on looking at the safety. And so these trials have to show that the benefits of the vaccine outweigh the potential risks or side effects. And only if they do would FDA grant approval or authorization for a vaccine. So the second is real world evidence. So these are no longer experimental vaccines. In the US, we have had 445 million doses given. That's a lot of people. And then globally, there's been over 7 billion doses given. We have a lot of data about the safety of these vaccines. And in a few minutes, I'll talk about the most common side effects that have been reported. Okay, so first I want to just talk about the monitoring systems that are in place to continuously evaluate. And I won't go into the details of each of these, but I wanted to put them all up here and just to show you that there are multiple vaccine safety monitoring systems. This is after all the stuff I just talked about that happens during the clinical trials. And these are used to monitor for potential safety concerns or adverse events, as we might call them, that might not have been seen during the trials. So there's some of these systems have been established for a long time and have been used for many vaccines like theirs. And then some were new and developed particularly for these COVID-19 vaccines, just to help guide all of our recommendations as things were moving very quickly, and we didn't want to slow things down too much, but we wanted to make sure we were collecting a lot of information about what type of side effects people were experiencing. And then many countries also have their own safety systems, and there are global efforts such as like the World Health Organization, other organizations looking at global safety data. So a lot of different places this is being evaluated. So what do all these things tell us so far? That some people have absolutely no side effects. And then there are a set of common side effects like swelling, the injection site redness. Some people experience a fever or feel like they have a fever with chills for a day or two, headache, muscle aches, tiredness, nausea, pretty much all of the same side effects as you might see from like the flu vaccine. The serious safety problems are extremely rare. So to date, the systems in place to monitor these have only found 2 types of serious health problems after vaccination, both are which are rare. So a small number of people have a severe allergic reaction called anaphylaxis. And this can occur after any vaccination. Some people experience it with food allergies, or I'm allergic to bees and I have to carry an EpiPen. So if this occurs, it would occur right away after your vaccination, and at the vaccination sites, they have EpiPens and medications to treat this reaction. So that's why you're asked to stay for 15 to 30 minutes after your vaccine, so you can be observed in case you have an allergic reaction and need that treatment. And then secondly, blood clots, specifically thrombosis, or what we call thrombocytopenia syndrome, was seen in a small number of women aged 18 to 49. And by small number, I mean it was like 7 out of each million who got the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So, women who are under 50, now we recommend that they get one of the other vaccines and not this vaccine, because of this risk, even though it's rare. And then there have been some reported cases of myocarditis or pericarditis in adolescent and young adults that after the second dose. And these are rare, and these have known treatments. So in most of those people, it's resolved after a few days. And there really have only been, I think it's 3 or 4 deaths that have actually been attributed out of these almost 8 billion vaccines that have been administered. And then lastly, we know that long-term side effects are very unlikely following any vaccination. And all of the vaccines that we have to date, all the monitoring we've done on these for the last almost 100 years, have shown that side effects happen generally within a month or 6 weeks of receiving a vaccine dose. So that's why for the clinical trials, the FDA required that each of the companies had to study these vaccines for at least 2 months after the final dose, but they've studied them much longer because we don't expect to see anything long term. We're not expecting that in 5 years some issue is going to come up that's attributed to these vaccines. That's never happened for any vaccine, and it's just kind of not the way the immune system works. So if through all these monitoring that's going to continue to happen forever, if there's ever any connection that scientists are seeing in collecting these data between a safety issue and a vaccine, then that requires the FDA to work with that vaccine company to figure out how to solve the problem, or maybe there was a specific lot of the vaccine that had an issue, or the vaccine would be pulled. So all this to say that there are known rare side effects. We don't want to cover that up in any way, and then there are these common side effects that are expected. But all this has to be weighed against the known higher risks from contracting COVID. We know that this virus can cause very serious illness and hospitalization in some people. Many of you probably know people who were very ill or even died. So we know that firsthand devastation this virus can cause. And we do know that a lot of people recover very quickly. But even in those, there are reports of long-term side effects, long-term impacts, or long COVID. So it's COVID infection and the growing evidence of persistent symptoms for a long time that are, to me, the most troubling unknowns that are still out there. Okay, so what are the current recommendations? So currently it's recommended that everyone should be vaccinated with one of the 3 vaccines that are authorized for use in the US, and with no contraindications or exceptions, except if you have a known allergy to one of the ingredients in the vaccine. And luckily, these vaccines were made without a lot of the common allergens in vaccines, like no egg products or things like that. But there is a link here to a list of the ingredients. And then, if someone does have an allergic reaction, it can be treated, and then they would be asked to get a different vaccine for their second dose or their booster or whatever. And then I already mentioned that for people who are immunocompromised would need 3 doses as part of their primary dose series. So boosters, what are booster shots and why do you need them? I talked about how vaccines teach our immune system how to fight diseases, right? So the immune response that our bodies produce can start to decline over time. And so we might need to get a refresher or an additional dose to get that level of antibodies back up. For example, we all get tetanus boosters every 10 years or so for adults. And so while that first primary series of doses creates that protection in a person who's never been immunized before, the booster can replace those defenses when they've started to fade. And because these are new vaccines, we didn't know that the immunity would decline. And we've been talking about boosters probably just a lot for the last couple of months, but it's really not a new idea. When they were being developed, we acknowledged that we're still learning about how long these vaccines can protect people, and we might have to boost. And so the studies that were done by Moderna and Pfizer showed that this additional booster after 6 months does replenish that immune response back up to that level, that peak level of protection, which is the evidence that was used to make a case for authorizing boosters. So I made this slide yesterday with some information from the CDC, and then like an hour or two ago, I saw this headline, and so just today the FDA authorized the Pfizer Moderna boosters for all adults. So before I was going to talk through all the different criteria to find out if you're eligible for a booster. So now everyone is eligible for a booster. So I think that people will start booking appointments soon, and the CDC is expected to give their recommendations in the next couple of days as well. Okay, so children and teens. So while COVID-19 does tend to be milder in children compared to adults, it can make some kids really sick and cause hospitalization, even deaths. So they're at a lower risk, but vaccination, now that we have vaccination for kids, it's important that they get vaccinated as well. And at this point, only the Pfizer vaccine is authorized for kids as young as 5 and for teens. So I think Moderna has already submitted all of their data and everything to the FDA, so that's under review. And I think that Johnson & Johnson is still working out their pediatric vaccine. So vaccinating kids doesn't only protect them, it can also help protect family members, including younger kids under 5 who aren't eligible to get vaccinated, and family members who might be at increased risk of getting severely ill. It can also help keep them in school and help them safely participate in sports and other group activities as well. And so most pediatricians' offices are offering pediatric vaccines, local pharmacies are as well, and other groups, as was mentioned earlier, that ARTH will start offering those as well. And for the youngest group, I just wanted to also mention for 5 to 11 years old, it is a lower dose than the adult dose, so it's not the exact same. Otherwise, the components are the same, but just the dose is lower. And while we're talking about this, because I did a Q&A a week or two ago where I got a lot of questions about the flu shot and when is the ideal time to get a flu shot and how does it affect the timing of the vaccine. So the ideal time is now. We're entering flu season. So you should get flu shots as soon as you can, and flu shots can be safely administered at the same time as your COVID vaccine. I have rheumatoid arthritis, so I had to get a 3rd dose of the COVID vaccine, and I did that back in September, and I got my flu shot on the same day. I got them in separate arms. I don't know if you actually have to, but I did that, and I didn't have any side effects, but some people might experience those typical flu shot side effects from that. Okay, so what to expect if you haven't been vaccinated. You understand that in the US there's no cost at all to vaccines. You don't have to provide proof of insurance. If you have insurance, they'll ask for it just so they can build, but you don't have to have insurance to get vaccinated, and you don't have to share anything about your immigration status either. As I mentioned, you have to wait for 15 to 30 minutes for observation period. The 30 minutes is for people who have other severe allergies and might be more prone to having a severe allergy. And at your first appointment, you should also make an appointment for your second dose, just so you don't forget and you get the timing right. You'll also receive a vaccination card to record your doses on what lot you got. And a lot of this information is also being digitized and available with your health record as well. I mentioned already the side effects that you might experience. And I also wanted to note that immediately after your vaccine, you can't just be like, okay, I'm going to go on an airplane now or go to the club. You're not considered fully vaccinated, and your immune response hasn't fully developed until 2 weeks after your last dose. So if it's a 2-dose vaccine, after that, 2 weeks after their second dose is when your immune response is fully developed. So there are a lot of benefits, just to yourself. You can reduce the chances of severe illness and death due to COVID. Some of the activities that you feel more comfortable resuming, like going to restaurants and if you travel, there's less restrictions if you're vaccinated. Even I think now still in King County, you have to have proof of vaccination or a negative test to go to many places, so it helps with that as well. And a lot of jobs or community organizations that require routine testing, you'll be exempt from that in a lot of cases. And I think most importantly is just more of the global health and public health impact of reducing transmission overall. Okay, so everyone over 5 years old is now eligible for COVID-19, but not everyone is vaccinated. In fact, looking at the US overall, it's like less than 60% of people are vaccinated. And some people are getting their first dose and not returning for their second dose. So why is that? We know that for some communities, there were issues with access, and that's improving a lot, but still an important piece of work that a lot of us are still working on to eliminate some of the barriers about how to get information about where to get vaccinated, booking appointments, getting there. Some people have challenges with getting time off of work and childcare, and those are issues that we need to continue to work on. But there's also continuing issues with hesitancy and reluctance or skepticism. So our top priority as researchers, as global health advocates, needs to be getting everyone vaccinated, ensuring that they have access and can get time off in childcare. There's mobile units that have been being deployed over the last year in many communities. But now it's like this big challenge of trying to increase vaccine confidence and dispelling some of the myths and misinformation that's out there. So I want to talk a bit more about that now. So I think very few people are truly anti-vaxxers, and I've been talking to a lot of community organizational groups and every friend and family member, and they all refer people over as well. Very few people are just truly against vaccines. More likely it's that people have fair and reasonable questions, and they just need information from people that they trust. But I also have to acknowledge that there are hoaxes out there. There's misinformation, which are just kind of honest mistakes. You're reading some information and you didn't quite understand it. Then there's disinformation, which is deliberately misleading information that is often put out online and social media in a very coordinated way, and hoaxes as well about conspiracy theories as well. And a lot of this can be refuted with science and evidence, but for as much science and evidence you throw at people, really might not make an impact if you don't start with listening. In a few minutes, I'll talk a bit more about how to spot some false information, how to talk to people who might be hesitant. But first, let's talk about some of the most commonly asked questions or myths. Okay, so many people wonder if the vaccines can give you SARS-CoV-2 infection. The answer is no. as I mentioned, the vaccines only contain copies or pieces of the virus that are made in a laboratory. And these pieces of the virus teach your body how to recognize it without actually showing giving the virus itself. So for example, if I give you like a wheel and a handlebars and a chain, you don't automatically have a bike. If I give you a steering wheel and tires, you don't have a car. And just like that, if I give you pieces of the virus, it cannot make the whole virus. And there's not been a single case of the vaccine causing COVID in anyone. Some people are also saying that once you've been vaccinated, once you've been infected with the virus, if you had COVID, that you have natural immunity and you don't need a vaccine. You do get some level of immunity from natural infection. However, this varies from individual to individual, and it does not last as long and is not as the protection is not as robust or consistent as vaccination. A recent study showed that unvaccinated people who had a recent infection were 5 times more likely to be reinfected compared to a vaccinated person. So the bottom line is, given what's known and not known about immunity, the people who've been infected with the virus should still get vaccinated. If you were infected and it was very severe and you got treatment with some of the monoclonal antibodies that are out there, you should talk to your doctor about when you should get the vaccine, because you might need to wait a month or so before doing that. Another set of concerns I hear a lot are about the impacts to pregnancy and fertility, and understandable that this is a very important thing for people, and this is their they want to protect their unborn children, or they want to make sure that if they're planning to have kids in the future, that this won't impact them. So there's been a lot of evidence growing, because now we have many more people who are pregnant who've been vaccinated. And all of the safety monitoring systems I talked about are collecting this data as well, and there's been no evidence for safety concerns for pregnant people who are vaccinated. And in contrast, pregnant people and people who recently were pregnant are more likely to get severely ill with COVID compared to non-pregnant people. So the benefits of the vaccine outweigh any known or potential risks of the vaccination during pregnancy. And if you're planning to have a family, and we've been hearing this question a lot as well, and I understand why folks would be concerned about long-term impacts, but there's no evidence that current vaccines, not just COVID vaccines, any vaccine, has ever caused a fertility problem. But becoming severely ill does have the potential to impact fertility and the health of a pregnancy. So there were a lot of false claims that were circulating online about this that I think led to a lot of the understandable concern from people who are pregnant. And then we also hear this question a lot: if the mRNA changes your DNA. I think there were some reports that were circulated online that some of these reports, y'all, look real, like they look like real scientific papers. People send me things, I'm like, what is this website? And there was a report circulating very early on about this. But so messenger RNA or mRNA is not able to modify your own genetic makeup in any way. And on top of that, this is really just like a signal to your cell. It goes to the outer part of your cell and doesn't enter the part of your cell where your DNA is. There's no way it can impact your DNA. In fact, the vaccine, the mRNA vaccine, is only present in your body for like 1 to 3 days, and then it degrades, and the immune system is primed and ready. So I like to think of it kind of like a Snapchat message with like instructions that are delivered to your immune system of how to fight the virus, and then it lasts for a couple days and then just disappears. So you're left with that, your immune system is left with that knowledge, that message that was transmitted, but the vaccine doesn't stick around and it can't impact your DNA. And then here's a few that I kind of already mentioned in some of my intro slides. Like we talked about the quick rollout and all the different steps that went into that. And we talked about, that people with food allergies or who are immune compromised or pregnant can be vaccinated, and that you cannot get the virus from the vaccine. Okay, so how can we take what we've learned to help our friends, family members, colleagues, and community members? I mentioned that there are some wild conspiracies out there, but a lot of people have fair and reasonable questions that we can help them with. And this, if you know people that are hesitant, the most important thing to do is to start with listening to them, to not downplay their concerns or dismiss them. I think there's a lot of mistrust in vaccines and the public health system that are a result of just feeling silenced and not heard and outright ignored in the past. And so I think breaking down that mistrust and engaging with people who are hesitant is really important. It won't happen by like talking at them or dismissing them or calling them nuts or stupid. Instead, we have to listen with empathy and engage with humility and compassion. To engage, I think just listening and understanding what questions they are, what information are they missing, acknowledging how they're feeling without, you don't have to necessarily agree, but acknowledge that, it's valid to have these concerns and that, you want to listen. And asking open-ended questions like, what have you heard about the vaccines, or why do you feel that way? Questions that elicit a response other than yes or no helps keep that conversation going and helps you better understand concerns that someone might have and help them walk through their thoughts. And then sharing clear information, accurate information that's easy to find, is also really helpful. If you don't know the answer or you're unsure about how to address their concern, you can offer to help look for information. And asking for their permission to help is also a good way to gain trust and make them more willing to listen to you than feeling like you're just pushing a lot of unwanted information on them. I know there have been times over the last year where, I've gotten impatient too, and I've just, tried to shut people down, but that really doesn't work. I found it just helps more to establish a relationship and make a personal connection with them, make them feel heard. And then using trusted messengers to boost credibility and it's really important. And some people might not trust their public health professionals or visit their health department website, and it might be more effective to reach them through channels that they look to for health information. Maybe it's their general practitioner or their family doctor, their religious leaders or community organizations. So referring them to someone that they trust is very helpful, and it's worth it. By having these thoughtful and kind conversations with people about vaccines, you're making a connection with them, but you're also making a significant public health contribution. And the decision to get vaccinated or not is a personal one, but it is a personal choice that affects the health and well-being of everyone right now. So these are just some tips on how to talk to people as well. And then, as I mentioned, there's a lot of web resources out there that may not be reliable, and some of them look very good. And some of them it's been like hard to prove to someone who sent it to me that it wasn't a reliable source, because they're getting really good at this. But here are just some tips to try to decipher what's credible given all the wealth of information that's out there. Ideally, the information on a website should have an identifiable source or author. And in considering the credibility, you should ask yourself whether that source is likely to be fair, objective, and lacking hidden motives. And taking that moment to look at the credentials of the source to determine whether the author or organization has the expertise. There have even been some doctors who are an orthopedic surgeon or something who have been saying a lot of stuff about either the virus or the vaccine. And although they're a doctor and they've gone through medical training, their expertise is in bones, and they're not an infectious disease scientist or an epidemiologist. So looking for those credible sources is important. And knowing that a person has a publication or whatever you're looking at, a website has the information on that website has undergone peer review, meaning a panel of professionals in the field have reviewed that information and find it valid, is another way to add credibility to a source. And you can also just, by simple things like looking at the website address, so like a .edu or .gov sites are generally more trustworthy. They're universities or government organizations. .org and .com, of a nonprofit organization or a company, those can be completely legitimate, but they also might not be. So that's another kind of quick clue to look at more closely. And then there are some certain red flags as well, like the information is anonymous, or there's a conflict of interest. That person works for a drug company or one of the vaccine companies, or it's very one-sided and biased in that way of not talking about the risks of vaccine as well, just talking about the benefits. That's also one-sided, or only talking about the risks. Looking at the date too, as I mentioned in the beginning, COVID-19 information is changing so quickly. So there's some information from early on in the pandemic that, things that we thought we understood that are no longer true. So looking for current information, making sure that there's citations of where the information comes from. If you're looking at a social media post, where did they get that information? Is it just from their own head or their next door neighbor or their auntie or uncle, or did they get it from a trusted source? And asking for that information as well. And all the information on the internet is very useful for researching health-related issues, but in the end, for a lot of people, especially those who can't really decipher some of the false information from the facts, the most important thing might be for them to talk with a trusted healthcare professional. And I have a list of some tips for how to do that, because it's normal for doctors to feel like the pressure to see so many patients in a day, and we all know how that can go. Sometimes when you go to the doctor's office and you have a ton of questions, but they're really busy and rushed, and then you forget them all, and you leave feeling like, I didn't get my questions answered. So I think it's important to kind of think through how you want to have this conversation with your doctor, if that's who you choose to talk to about vaccines, and to get the most out of your time and their time. So setting an agenda, I think, is helpful. Many doctor's visits last like 15 minutes, so you have to prioritize your concerns by setting an agenda, or you might get taken on a tangent and might not get to the important topics you want to cover. So for me, sometimes I get nervous, or I might get annoyed that I've been waiting a long time and I forget my questions. So I put them on a Post-it, and I introduce them at the start of the visit so the doctor knows what I want to focus on. And it doesn't have to be like a complex list. It can just be a quick note to yourself of things that you want to discuss. And it also helps to control your anxiety by expecting a good outcome before that appointment starts. Instead of going in with a negative attitude, you might not be setting yourself up for success if you think that they're not going to listen or it's not going to go well. And then third, be honest about your worries and concerns, and break it down for them. And you can share more than the things that you think the doctor needs to know, because sometimes we think a doctor doesn't want to know or need to know about our life and our social life, our relationships at home or at work. But providing this detailed information helps the doctor get to know you, get a full picture of your overall health and well-being. And also they pick up on lifestyle factors and things that might be contributing to your health. And some stuff you might think is embarrassing, you don't want to share, or it's a stupid question, but these are professionals, they've heard it all, They're also required to protect your privacy. And then fourth, ask questions and emphasize what are your main concerns, right? So what are you most worried about? And the information that the doctor is giving you back might be very overwhelming. So you should also feel comfortable like asking them as many times as you need to understand their advice or their guidance. And if you focus on your main concerns, then the doctor might be able to better explain their rationale or reasoning for their recommendations. And fifth, confirm your understanding. So I'm a research scientist, but my training is in infectious disease. So there's many areas of health that I don't understand as well as my doctor. And sometimes they'll speak in jargon and it's confusing. So it's perfectly fine to say, sorry, I'm not following. Can you explain that in another way? I like to also repeat the information back to make sure I'm understanding it. It helps me absorb it, but it can also help the doctor know that you've understood. And then finally, it's important to work with your doctor for the best outcome long term, whether it's vaccine questions or any other health concern. If your doctor recommends a treatment or a vaccine and you're still unsure, share your worries, share your concerns, and what other questions that you might have, and actively partner with them to continue understanding your concerns, your worries, and make treatment decisions that are most likely to work for you. It's a win for you, it's a win for your doctor, so you shouldn't be afraid to ask questions or make sure you understand everything. Some doctors are really good at this stuff, but others need work. So if you follow some of these tips, you'll get the most of your time together and it will make future conversations easier. And if you're talking to someone about vaccines and you're recommending they go talk to their doctor, talk to them about this approach as well. It might help them out a lot. Okay, so in summary, we've talked about the benefits of COVID-19 vaccination and how they outweigh the known and potential risks. And we now that these vaccines are widely available at no cost, everyone who's eligible should be vaccinated so that we can move forward from this pandemic and really reduce the suffering and death that's going on. And there's still a lot of bad information out there, so we can help people by listening to them and sharing credible information, and also referring them to trusted healthcare providers for more information as well. So if you don't know where to get vaccinated, go to vaccines.gov, or you can text your zip to this number. And then the CDC website is a really great source for a lot of information. A lot of the graphics I got are from there as well. And then our website is here. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And also preventcovidwa.org is a collaboration between the COVID-19 Prevention Network and the state of Washington. So there's a lot of good information there as well. And definitely want to make a plug for our YouTube. There's some really great information and seminars on there, and there's a COVID in Black series that's been excellent, and there's been a lot of great panelists on there. So hopefully you'll find that useful as well. So thank you all for your attention. I know that was a lot of information, and I'm happy to take some questions. And if I can't answer them, I'll find answers for you.
Yeah, so there are some in the chat. And once we get through the chat, you all can come off mute and ask your questions one by one. So one of the first questions was relevant to the various other vaccines that you mentioned. So they were asking, where are the other ones used?
Yeah, so the two I mentioned by Sanofi and Novavax are not, they're still in clinical trials. They're in phase 3 clinical trials. I think Novavax is the one we'll hear about next. And they might be added to like our approved vaccines here in the US. But we also know that there's a lot of the world that doesn't have access to vaccines yet. So they might, also be used more widely there. In other parts of the world, there are other approved and authorized vaccines too, like I think 4 or 5 of them. I know for sure one that was developed in China, and one in India, and one in Russia. Those aren't authorized or approved for use in the US, but they are in other countries. So there are a number, I think, and in clinical trials still I think there are like 50 or more. So maybe there'll be something even better than the current vaccines.
Another question is, so what happens if you're fully vaccinated and still contract COVID? Would you need another round of vaccination? Yeah, what does that look like?
So the same rules apply. So if you get a breakthrough infection, meaning you're 2 weeks past your second dose and you still get COVID, then all the same recommendations would apply as for someone who didn't get COVID. So now that boosters are recommended for everyone, you would be recommended to get a booster as well.
And so another question is they're referencing the new variants and saying, are they not as mild in children?
Yeah, overall, all the variants are more mild in children, but that's not the case for every child. And it's kind of frustrating to see a lot of the conversation around that right now since the pediatric vaccines were approved, where people are like, well, kids don't really get that sick or die from COVID anyways. Well, I think there were, I have to check this to be sure, but I think there were like 200 kids that have died in the US. Like that's kids, children. That's one, one is too many. So not particularly focused on certain variants that are impacting children more, but overall there are less cases in kids, but I still think it's absolutely worth getting vaccinated.
Another question is, how long will the booster shot last before you have to get another booster?
Well, we don't know because, we're learning this stuff as we go because we haven't had people vaccinated long enough. The people who are first vaccinated in the trials are kind of, like 6 to 12 months ahead of the general population. So we will know, in the next several months or a year. I think a lot of researchers are predicting that, this will be like a 3 or 4 dose vaccine, and then it will be like annual boosters like a flu shot, but we can't say that for sure as we're just learning as we go.
Someone asked, where does the vaccine go when it disappears after 1 or 2 days?
It's just degraded and metabolized, so it's that message is just basically disintegrated, so it doesn't stick around in your body. What sticks around is that training that was given to your immune system so that it remembers to how to fight the virus.
Another question that we have is, I think I saw that getting tested for COVID before or after traveling, depending on where you're traveling to, is not necessary. Is not necessarily recommended, and they're curious as to if you can explain why, or if that is accurate information.
I think like for air travel, I think it was kind of dependent on airlines, but I believe now, as of November 15th, that either a proof of vaccination or a negative test within the last couple of days is required by all airlines. I'd have to double check to confirm it's all, but at least the major ones, that's the case. And I think that for me, I love traveling. I haven't gotten on an airplane yet. We have a lot of international conferences. I usually go to South Africa every year. I've not done it, and a lot of it is because of the lack of requiring vaccines. Because people who if you're just required to provide a negative test in the last few days, to me that's not enough. Because I've seen people on like social media who have said like, hey, I got my negative test, I'm gonna go travel and go abroad, and then that night they're at a concert or something after they have their negative test. So to me, I don't feel I agree that it doesn't make sense, but I think that's a lot of airline regulations and things that I don't really know that much about.
Well, another question that I had is how does the vaccine work for folks who have low immune systems, compromised immune systems, those who are like on chemo,
Yeah.
where it is purposefully suppressing their immune system for whatever reason? How does that work?
Yeah, so like I was talking about how I have rheumatoid arthritis, so I have to take an immunosuppressive drug. So in my case, because of that drug, like my immune response to the vaccine didn't get high enough, so I had to get a third dose. So I got a third dose in September, and then 6 months after that, I'll have to get a booster. There are some people, depending on what type of drug it is or what type of condition, there may be different guidance. So you have to talk to your doctor. Like I had to stop taking my medication when I got my third dose to help my immune response get up that high. So for some people that's being recommended, but obviously not for everyone, because for some people stopping their medication would be very detrimental. But yeah, if you're on immunosuppressants, you don't get that same robust immune response. So that's definitely problematic. Yeah.
And what is the difference between like third dose and booster?
Yeah, so a third dose really applies to those people we were just talking about who have immunosuppression because of an illness or a medication that they're taking. So for them to get to that level of immunity that an otherwise healthy person would get to after the 2 shots, we would need 3 shots. So that's why we call that a third dose. Whereas a booster, it's because your immunity has waned over time and you want to get it back up to that peak amount. So some people use them interchangeably. I don't think it's too important to differentiate it, but that's the technical differentiation.
Okay, so like the makeup of the vaccine is not different or like
Nope,
lower or
no,
higher.
exactly the same vaccine. Yeah.
Thank you. We have a couple questions in the chat box. One of them is, are booster shots mandatory after taking 2 shots, considering that some people have not yet received their first?
Yeah, so at this point, it's not mandatory, and you're still considered fully vaccinated if you have your 2 shots or the one of the Johnson and Johnson. Um, that might change with time because like we've done some modeling to look at like the way the pandemic is right now, the number of new infections, and if nobody got boosted, then like next year we would have another like 300,000 deaths in this country, which is a lot. So that's I think why the FDA moved quickly to try to authorize boosters for all adults now. But it's at this point it's not a requirement. Like if you have to have a vaccine for certain for a job or for certain events you're going to, or to go to a restaurant, they're not going to yet require that you have a booster. I don't know when that will change, but it's possible that will change.
We have a few more questions. These will be some of the last three. If you have a question, please put in the chat box. So one of them is there any advantage, disadvantage to getting a different vaccine for the booster than what your initial first 2 doses were?
Yeah, there's just some recent studies. One that was done in the U.S. and I think one was in Israel. I can't remember where the third was, but that there could be some advantage that if you do what we call the mix and match approach. So if you got the Pfizer vaccine for your 2 primary doses to get the Moderna booster, that you do seem to get like a boosted immune response even more. It's not like hugely different. So that's why at this point they're saying it's a personal choice. So if you did get Moderna, you can get the Pfizer for a booster, or if you got Pfizer for your primary, you can get the Moderna for your booster. And it's like what's available to you and personal choice. I ended up getting Pfizer for 3, but I know people who got Pfizer for their first 2 who are going to get Moderna for their booster because of that mix and match study to show there was a slight advantage to that.
Thank you. Another question is might be a little specific, but how long do you have to wait for getting your booster or getting the vaccine before you get a shingles vaccine?
Yeah, the current recommendation is you can get any other vaccine at the same time as getting your booster. If you don't want to, then you can wait, for however long you need to or feel like you should, but there's no danger in getting them together.
Awesome. And then one more question. You may have or may not have answered this, but so if you have, it's just worded a different way, but if you have if you've had COVID and then you got vaccinated, is that considered immunity?
Yeah, actually, so we see that so if you just had COVID and not a vaccine, your antibody or immune response level is kind of like here. If you get vaccinated, it's like here. If you had COVID and then you get vaccinated, it's a little bit better. So it's still worth getting it after you've had COVID. As I mentioned, if you did have to take those monoclonal antibodies during your infection, then you should talk to your doctor about when to get vaccinated because there's some guidance about waiting a certain period. If you didn't take any COVID-specific monoclonal antibodies for your treatment, then you can get vaccinated.
So we don't have any more questions right now, but if you all think of any, you can put them in the chat box. Recorded. I will be sending out the recording once it's just done some few editing, and our presenter, Dr. Randhawa, will send out some resources to me, and I will forward them to you all to be able to have and share with your networks. So thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to see you at another training. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We appreciate you.
Yes, I appreciate you all. This was wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Randhawa, for your presentation. It was very informative.
Thanks so much for having me.